Doctor, I did suggest that if, well taken, I did suggest that there are alternatives, and I mentioned the Far East. Could I draw you on that particular statement?
Yes, it's another line which I hear a lot of, that somehow it's almost like a reverse threat to me. Well, Turner, you can take away your companies and all these people because we'll turn to China and the Far East, and it implies that somehow there's a competition, which I think is the wrong way to look at it. All investment in Kenya is good for Kenya. That's a good thing. Do I want British companies to be part of that? Absolutely. As I've said, probably 40% of the capitalization on the Nairobi Stock Exchange is British companies, 5.5 of the top 10 taxpayers in the country. So we are deeply embedded in Kenya. So factually,
there are relationships that sort of come to some sort of schism.
Well,
I mean, they're not cast in sort of eternal stone.
All the relationships evolve, so most of those companies now are not making widgets and things that in the past Kenya has brought, because our manufacturing base is not what it was in the UK, as you know. So it is a different and evolving relationship. But to imply that somehow it's a zero-sum game, either we trade with...
I'm just querying with the same assurance that you give of the input of British companies, whether you could speak with equal assurance as to the benefits to the Kenyan people in terms of money and what we'd stand to gain, or rather what we'd stand to lose if it were to end. So for example, you can say there's a company called X, we make sort of Harrier jets or whatever, and if this were to happen, because it could work in a rather cynical fashion that it's all to the good of the British economy and not ours.
Well, I'm not talking about the benefit to the British economy, I'm talking about the benefit to the Kenyan economy.
Right.
So if those British companies said, do you know what, there's a global recession, we'll take our money elsewhere, and you lose 40% of the Nairobi Stock Exchange and 5.5 of your top 10 taxpayers, I think self-evidently that's bad for Kenya. But that doesn't mean it has to be a sort of British-China competition. We do a lot of collaboration with China. So, for example, take infrastructure. China builds a lot of the infrastructure in this country. We in Britain have huge expertise in project planning and implementation of infrastructure projects. That's good for everyone. That's good collaboration. So I'm not making threats about whether that trade goes away or under what circumstances which company will stay. That's commercial business. What I'm saying is that our economies are deeply intertwined. Partnership again. That's good for Kenya, that's good for Britain, and my job as the guy sitting in the middle trying to protect and promote that relationship is to do my level best to continue making that happen.
Too much to discuss, too little time. Let's keep the E-word elections and look at the actual conduct of the elections. We've now established that everybody has an interest. The defense of that interest, I mean, we could go on all day, and one could defend, theses could be written on the topic. What role might you play to make sure that these elections are free and fair?
This is not about the role of the international community. This is about the role of Kenya. And I said earlier, I'm optimistic. And I'm fundamentally optimistic. And I'm optimistic for a number of...
Right.
Well, let me explain why, and I'll address...
I'll draw you on that. When you said the word optimism, I'm optimistic because A, B, C, and D. Is that possible?
That is possible.
Yes.
So A, I'm optimistic because of the Constitution.
Right.
What
so it's a document.
What that's
nice
put
words.
in place. No, and look, I'm a great believer, and I say to people, it's taken us in Britain 200 years to write and develop our Constitution, and we still haven't written it down. So pole pole, implementing that document is going to take time. I take your point. But it has put in place a series of structures, of institutions, which I think are for the good and for bettering Kenya. The role of the judiciary, the leadership of Willy Mutunga, the dispute resolution processes. So there is a very important message to people. If you don't like the result of the election, if you have grievances which you think are legitimate, address them through the processes set out in the Constitution and through the courts, not through violence on the streets. That is a very, very profound and important principle.
Right, so number one was the Constitution. A.
So I am positive about the Constitution. B, the judiciary. C, the IEBC. Confidence levels in the IEBC are now at over 90% after what they've done on voter registration. They registered more people a day than they were near able to do in 2010 for the referendum. It is a complex and a difficult task they are doing. You ask what we're doing to support that. We are the largest single donor to the IEBC, Britain that is. It's paid through a blind basket through the UNDP body, and what that means is we can't tell Ahmed Isaac Hassan how to spend that money, so he keeps his independence, but we're supporting it because we believe in the importance of good governance and the rule of law. I think the final point I would make is my belief that fundamentally the Kenyans I talk to realize how damaging the violence in 2008 was. The GDP of the country dropped to about 5% and took 4 years to recover. We could talk about the number of the tourists that left, and everyone across the political divide, the elite, people on the street, say to me these elections must be safe, credible and fair. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of work to do, that doesn't mean we can be complacent, but I think people do realise the importance of a smooth transition, Vision 2030, and emphasising President Kibaki's legacy.
Dr. Turner, I think it's perhaps unfair to look at the conduct of another European and ex-colonial power in Africa that we're living in interesting times. I'm thinking obliquely about Mali, or specifically, not obliquely. And this idea, if you put it in very simplistic terms, that an ex-colonial power, the things are falling apart. And again, you know, history was taking its own course. I mean, bloody battles would have been fought and things would have changed. But here you're saying, we'll go in there, we'll restore the status quo, and then we'll leave. Basically, we'll fight your battles for you. That's what the French seem to be doing. I'm not a diplomat. I haven't got a PhD in history like yourself. But it seems to me that the British might do the same if an outcome in Kenya didn't meet their expectations. They'd come in and sort it out.
I think I cannot see
to preserve their interests.
I cannot see a remote parallel between those two cases. The debate...
We have oil in Turkana.
You do have oil in Turkana.
Lots of oil in Turkana. People like oil.
Being developed by a British company, I may say. Look, the debate about liberal intervention and when countries intervene is at the heart of whole schools of studies on international relations, which we're not going to do justice to now. I don't really want to speak about Mali because that is a French campaign. You can talk to my friend, the French ambassador, about it. Maybe to answer your question, let's take Libya.
Let's abandon that entirely. Let's abandon that entirely, but take another example. When you have this idea of criticism and imposition, which is a word that you used earlier on, when an African statesman says he will not sit at the same table as an English Prime Minister, as in Desmond Tutu, Tony Blair, isn't he also making, from an African standpoint, a tacit condemnation of the role in which a British Prime Minister condemned himself? But he's probably going around the world giving lecture tours and whatever and being feted wherever he goes. Or am I too...
So I don't understand the question. Do I have a problem with what Desmond Tutu is saying and his rights to criticise Tony Blair?
Perhaps I put it badly. I'm just saying to have the power to criticise and impose a code of conduct when your own leadership has been subjected to similar criticism by a person who's been in line for the Nobel Peace Prize or something and happens to be African, with the stress on African.
I'm still not sure I understand the parallel. Why? I have no problem with...
I'm saying your leaders, one of your leaders, has been criticised in pretty much the same breath as Omar Bashir, for example. No, and you're saying, no, it's not the same.
I don't think, on the factual hard evidence, I can accept a parallel between Tony Blair and Omar Bashir.
Right.
And nor does that stand up before the face of the International Criminal Court.
So why would a man like Desmond Tutu not sit at the same lunch table with him?
Well, that's Desmond Tutu's position. I respect Desmond Tutu.
So he must have thought it through.
Well,
I mean, if he were here, you're going to say, come and interview him as well.
But John, take a different example.
Right.
I worked in Washington, D.C. For the British government during the time of George Bush. George Bush and Tony Blair were very close premiers. They disagreed fundamentally on some issues and publicly did so. The idea that international leaders and countries cannot maintain relationships and friendships while fundamentally disagreeing with each other, I think is difficult. Go back to your question on Mali, because I think it's a good one. The question
I hope it's a good one.
The question of whether or not the coalition force that was led by Britain, France and America should have gone into Libya, an African country, and the facts that led up to that. Muammar Gaddafi,
shoot him.
Was he a friend or was he a foe?
And all these images that we saw of people sort of going into his tented camp, going off to the Elysee.
Was that the right thing to do or not? Was that justifiable, or should we have walked away? Now there was a big debate in the UK. There was a debate within the British government, which I was a part of. We'd had the experience of Iraq. And the very well documented difficulties you refer to, Tony Blair. We'd also had the example of Kosovo and the Balkans.
Right.
And when we were looking at the threat on Benghazi by Gaddafi's troops, many people said we cannot let this happen again. So there were a very specific set of circumstances in this case, very specific, and the Western-led intervention was triggered by a request from the Arab League to help. Please help stop a massacre in Benghazi. Now, history will judge whether or not that campaign was justified. In the end, the Gaddafi regime was overthrown, and arguably a better one was there. I don't
Dr.
think...
Turner, the last word on whatever topic, because you have to have the last word now because of time.
Well, I don't think what I'm saying is that we should reduce our international relations to a reductive argument about interfere or don't interfere. As I say, our countries are close partners, historic friends. That partnership runs deep, it runs wide. My job is to promote that. I respect the choice, the democratic choice of the Kenyan people. I also urge continued cooperation with the ICC, and that Kenya acts in accordance with its international legal obligations, and that if the Kenyan people have grievances in the upcoming elections, if politicians have grievances, they address those through peaceful, legitimate means as set out in the Constitution.
Dr. Christian Turner, thank you very much.
Asante sana.